Hello and welcome. Happy World Food Day. I have the absolute best guest for you today to learn all about how glyphosate harms our health and harms our environment. My guest is Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Dr. Stephanie Seneff is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She has a bachelor's degree in biology with a minor in food and nutrition. And so that explains why she understands these things so deeply, even though she spent her career in electrical engineering and computer science, which is what she has her PhD in. She's done her entire career, including her education at MIT, and she has written a very important book. It's called Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and Our Environment. And this book really made it to the mainstream. It was listed on the Best of 2021 list for Kirkus Reviews. So the word is getting out. And I'm so happy to have this opportunity to pick Dr. Seneff's brain about glyphosate. Welcome, Dr. Seneff.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So, Dr. Seneff, the most recent talk that I saw of yours was at the Children's Health Defense Food Summit, and you were mostly focused on the environment, but you quickly summarized the main things that you've discovered in your research on glyphosate. And so I want to start there. The first is that you were looking for things that impacted autism, things in our environment that might be possible causes of autism. I'm sure you found many, but glyphosate is one of them. And what you learned is that it disrupts the sulfate process in the body. So can you start real simply with what is sulfate?
Okay, that's a place to start. Sulfate is overlooked, I must say, in the literature. There are papers about it, but not enough. And sulfate is a very important anion, a negatively charged molecule. It has a sulfur atom and it's surrounded by 4 oxygen atoms. So sulfur and oxygen combined with a negative charge. And it populates the entire body. It actually is extremely important for transporting lipid-soluble molecules. And there are many lipid-soluble molecules that are very important in health, such as, for example, cholesterol and vitamin D and all the hormones, the sex hormones, and these aromatic amino acids and things like polyphenols. So there's all these different molecules, and it also, of course, toxic metabolites that are fat soluble. So one of the things sulfate does is to make those toxic metabolites water soluble so they can be shipped through the blood and out through the kidneys. So you have a hard time getting rid of fat soluble. So molecules that are toxic that are not soluble in water, it makes them soluble in water. And of course, with cholesterol, it adds a sulfate to cholesterol, making it soluble in water, making it able to go out through the bloodstream. And actually, the cholesterol sulfate goes into the membranes of the lipid particles, which is LDL, HDL. You hear about high LDL, you get on a statin drug. If the LDL molecule has sulfate sticking out around it because of the cholesterol sulfate, it protects it. The sulfate forms a gel. It turns the water into gel, and it protects the LDL particle from damage from sugar and from damage from fat, from sugar and from oxygen. And that is actually what makes the LDL toxic, and that's what ends up causing heart disease. So actually, heart disease, I think, is a sulfate deficiency problem. And autism is too, I'm sure of that. So that might be enough to say for now. That one gets a bit, but also, of course, glyphosate suppresses many of the enzymes that are involved in the sulfate metabolism. So it disrupts the whole sulfate system. It prevents you from sulfating things, which means you're going to have much more toxic effect from fat-soluble toxins, for one thing. And of course, also cholesterol and vitamin D, it's harder to distribute them throughout the body.
And so can it get into the brain? Can it make these toxins go into the brain?
Well, the sulfate is what protects you, right? So when there isn't enough sulfate, then those toxins become much more problematic in the brain. And in fact, when you have pathogens growing in the gut, they release toxic metabolites that need to be sulfated. And if they can't be sulfated, they can become toxic in the brain.
All right. The gut-brain axis, a very important aspect of autism. So now that you figured that out, are there things that people can do to increase that natural process of do you say sulfitation?
Sulfation, yeah, sulfation.
Sulfation.
And,
Yes.
right. Well, the most important thing to do is to get rid of the glyphosate, because I think the
Mhm.
glyphosate is a major player in disrupting it. And I want to add that it's interesting with autism because they have these mice that are autistic. They make these mouse models of autism, and they have been found in multiple studies that the mice that have autism have deficient heparin sulfate in the brain ventricles, and autistic humans do too. They've looked post-mortem, deficient heparin sulfate in the brain ventricles, and they've also seen deficient activity of an enzyme that sulfates polyphenols in the gut. There's a recent paper that talks about this with respect to autism. And these papers are not talking about glyphosate because they're not aware that glyphosate disrupts the sulfate system. So when you connect the dots, you can figure out that the reason why these kids don't have enough sulfate in their brain, I think a major player is glyphosate. And I think glyphosate is the primary cause of the epidemic. As you say, other things cause autism. I
Mhm.
think glyphosate is the reason why the rates are going up, the primary reason.
Yeah, it makes sense that it would be a systems thing and that it would be something that would accumulate the impact of toxicity or toxins within your system. Are there any supplements that people can take, like aside from
Well,
detoxing and trying to have a totally clean diet? Anything else that you can do to increase
well,
the process?
Well, certainly getting a high sulfur diet is important. And actually, many of the autistic kids are sensitive to sulfur. So they tend to avoid sulfur containing foods. And the reason why they're sensitive is because of glyphosate disrupting those enzymes, or they could have defective versions of those enzymes from genetics. But a lot of people complain about they can't eat foods that contain sulfur. They're trying to avoid sulfur containing foods, and they get a sulfur deficient diet as a consequence. And then that propagates into the whole system because if you don't have enough sulfate lining your blood vessels, your blood's not going to circulate well. It depends upon those sulfates to create that gel that makes a slick layer that the red blood cells can just slide through as they go through the capillaries. It's extremely important for many, many reasons, the heparin sulfate. It also facilitates uptake of different important nutrients for the cells. So many things that it does. And I think that most of us are sulfate deficient because of this chronic exposure to glyphosate, and that's causing blood problems as well as autism and heart disease and many other things. But getting back to what you can do, I mean, there's sulfur-containing foods. Eating seafood, for example, is a good source of sulfur. Organic eggs are a wonderful resource. You're looking for nutrient-dense foods, so you want to eat foods that are high in sulfur, and of course also the minerals and the vitamins and all of that. We have a vitamin and mineral deficient diet, especially if we're eating all processed foods. So stay away from processed foods, eat whole foods, make sure they have a certified organic label. These are all really good practices. Food is medicine, and I think the most important thing is to change a diet to be healthy. There are supplements you can take, and there's a lot of them that I list on a slide. Methylsulfonylmethane is an interesting one, MSM. You can take chondroitin sulfate, glucosamine sulfate. So that's giving you the sulfate. They always talk about getting glucosamine, but you're actually getting the sulfate as well. And there's magnesium sulfate, which is actually Epsom salts. I actually am very fond of soaking in bath water with Epsom salts, throwing a little bit of Epsom salts into the bath water. The sulfate gets absorbed, magnesium and sulfate. And magnesium is also another problematic mineral that is often deficient. So you get magnesium and sulfate through the skin. Doesn't involve the diet at all. So that's a great way to get sulfur if you've got a sulfur deficiency problem in the gut. But I think if you go organic, you might get rid of your sulfur deficiency problem. So that becomes very important to go organic. So eating organic food, eating foods that are rich in sulfur. I think also eating a high fat diet, especially animal fats. And a lot of people are surprised by that. That actually fats are they're very important for the brain. The brain actually has much more cholesterol compared to its weight than the rest of the body. The brain has a lot of cholesterol, and it's really important for the neurons, for their neurotransmission processes to work correctly. So cholesterol deficiency actually could be a causal factor in autism. If kids are eating a diet that is very low in fat, it's not good for autism. You want to eat a high fat diet, especially animal-based foods, and also seafood. Seafood is incredibly healthy. And I know the kids maybe are picky eaters, and so they're not maybe inclined to want to eat seafood, but fish and also, of course, shellfish.
Yeah, I heard about that also with Alzheimer's, that there was a link between cholesterol lowering drugs and Alzheimer's because of that problem of the brain needing that cholesterol. Is
That's
that
right.
true?
It's absolutely the case. I'm actually so frustrated with the mainstream for this extreme messaging that says, don't eat foods that contain cholesterol. It is really the wrong message, even for the heart. It's the wrong message. I feel very confident about that. The problem is the cholesterol can become problematic if there's not enough sulfate. And that's what the problem is. It's not the cholesterol, it's the sulfate, because that makes it hard to transport cholesterol. And you have to package it up inside LDL particles. The liver has to package it up inside the particles because it's not water soluble. And those particles are vulnerable because they don't have sulfate in their membrane, not enough sulfate, because of this deficiency problem. So they get attacked. So when the LDL particles get attacked, they become oxidized, they become glycated, and then that's when they start to gather in the vessels that are feeding the heart and cause clogging of the arteries because of a lack of sulfate, not because of too much cholesterol.
Oh gosh, if only everyone knew this, we would all be so much healthier. Yeah, this really makes sense. All right, I want to go on to the second major discovery that you made relating to glyphosate, and that it was that glyphosate substitutes for the coding amino acid glycine. So first start for folks like me who didn't take any science classes in college. First, what is glycine and what does it mean to have a coding amino acid?
Okay, good. That's a good place to start. And it disappoints me that people don't learn that in like 8th grade. They should learn about the DNA code and how the proteins are assembled like beads on a string according to the code. It's a 4-letter code, and then they're parsed 3 ways. So you've got three-letter sequence, and the order matters. So there's a GGX is codes for glycine, and G is not glycine. That's the guanine. That's the nucleotide. So you have the nucleotides. The 4 letters are nucleotides. They represent 4 different nucleotides, and the whole DNA is only made up of those 4 nucleotides. It's quite parsimonious, really, but the code is by putting them together in patterns, and each pattern signifies a particular amino acid. It's really elegant. It's a very elegant code. I remember learning about it when I was a kid. It first came out. It was a big news. Watson and Crick, discovering the DNA. I was maybe 10 years old. I was so excited to see that. So it kind of, it attracted me to biology, I would say, the DNA story, which is so amazing. And so you basically run through this ticker tape, taking 3 letters at a time and then turn each one into an amino acid. So then you have the amino acids all are like paper dolls. They hold hands. And this long sequence of amino acids, that becomes a protein. And it can be, over 1,000 amino acids all strung together to make one protein. So they're pretty amazing. And then the amino acids are on a string, and then they have to fold. And of course, folding is really complicated too. And that's something we don't really understand exactly how they manage to fold into the way they need to be. But the whole process is practically a miracle. And glycine is one of those coding amino acids. There's about 20 of them altogether. And also the aromatics are 3 of them. Those come out of the shikimate pathway, which glyphosate famously disrupts. So we get deficiencies in those as well. Glyphosate is a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine molecule, except that there's a missing proton from the nitrogen, and it's replaced with something called a methylphosphonate. So it's a bulked up glycine molecule, but it has the exact shape that you need to fit into the glycine code. And therefore, it can substitute for glycine when the protein is being assembled according to the code. Does that make sense?
It does. So does it have to get into the cell? It has to break the cell barrier, get into the cell, get into that process where you can explain it, but the DNA and the RNA are making proteins.
Yeah, right. And then so they're trying to find a glycine, and they find a glyphosate instead, and they put it in there. As long as there's room, of course, if it has bulky amino acids on both sides, it probably won't fit because it's got that extra methylphosphonate. But if the neighbors are small, then it can fit its methylphosphonate and stick it sort of into the space. And often it occupies the space that the substrate is supposed to fit into. So it blocks the substrate. So it messes up the protein. This is exactly what happens with EPSP synthase. That's the famous protein that gets disrupted by glyphosate in the plants. That's what kills the weeds. That's well known.
So it's designed, is it designed that way? That's the
Well, they don't claim. Their evidence is overwhelming. And I have a whole chapter in my book that addresses the evidence from their studies. The agrochemical industry's own studies show that glyphosate suppresses this enzyme, but it doesn't suppress it if it has an alanine there instead of the glycine. So there's a glycine that sits at that place where it binds phosphate. Phosphate is in the substrate, PEP, phosphoenolpyruvate. And so there's room for that phosphate, which is critical for the enzyme to do its job. But glyphosate comfortably slips its methylphosphonate unit into the phosphate spot. And now the substrate's blocked. It can't get close. And the enzyme's dead in the water. So glyphosate completely kills that enzyme. It can't work at all if it's substituting for the glycine. But if you change the code so it's alanine instead of glycine, alanine is sort of the closest amino acid to glycine. It has an extra methyl group. which gets in the way and causes trouble, but the protein still works better than it would, it doesn't work as well as it would without that alanine, but it's not nearly as bad as having glyphosate because that's a much bulkier extra thing that's stuck in there. So when the protein has alanine instead of glycine, glyphosate can't work on it at all. It completely doesn't work. And they know that. They've studied it. They found out it just completely kills glyphosate's effect on that protein. And that's how they figured out to do the GMO crops, because they stuck alanine there instead of glycine. That's what protects the crop from glyphosate, by getting rid of that glycine. So to me, it's Occam's razor says the answer is that it's substituting for the glycine in the protein itself. But they're not saying that. They have tremendous evidence that that's what's going on, but they won't say it. They say that instead glyphosate's getting in the way of the phosphate. It's blocking the substrate. It's becoming a substitute substrate, is what they say. But it's not correct, because it wouldn't cause it to completely be unable to work if you change the code. The easiest answer to that is that it's substituting. Also, it's known there are many toxic substances that work by substituting for amino acids during protein synthesis. This is not the first time that's ever happened, and they know that. So I don't know of any other molecule that substitutes for glycine, but I know of many other amino acids that can get substituted to cause severe disease.
I think the story that Monsanto tells is that they just accidentally found that there was a bacteria that could withstand glyphosate application. It was just like out there in their dump pile.
Yes.
That's probably apocryphal, right? Because
I know.
Yeah, I guess we don't have to say more. People can make up their own minds about that. But yeah, so this is why. So I remember reading your paper about the shikimate pathway, and you listed so many different, very common problems that have become common since glyphosate was introduced into our food system, since we created, or not we, but Monsanto created the genetically modified crops that withstand extra amounts of glyphosate, and then all of the different things that have happened since then, the Roundup resistant weeds, using Roundup as a drying agent prior to harvest on all kinds of crops, even the ones that aren't GMO, using Roundup to terminate cover crops. Like, they have just found so many ways to use Roundup, and all of these ways just happen to mean that you have to continuously use more and more Roundup. There doesn't seem to be a limit in terms of their system to when the amount of Roundup being used might stop or ever decrease. So it's a very insidious business model. But then you figured out that this glycine insertion, this problem that glyphosate causes to plants, and I guess you said this is not just plants and animals, it's fungi, it's all kinds of microorganisms, it's the soil life, it's everything. Everything needs to use glycine, right? To make protein. And then everything is getting its protein making capacity broken by this chemical. So why don't you give us your favorite example of that? You already gave us one, but you can tell us a little bit more about, or maybe the light bulb moment. I really love to hear that story. Like when you figured that out, then it must have set off a lot of light bulbs, because you know how important glycine is in protein creation. So it must have, I mean, and probably you haven't finished going through all of the proteins that require glycine that glyphosate might be disrupting.
That's right. And in fact, I've been rummaging through the literature looking for glycine susceptibilities forever. Ever since I discovered glyphosate, I look for proteins that have glycines that have to be glycine. If it's mutated, the protein's dead in the water, especially if it's mutated into aspartate or glutamate, because those two are both good models for glyphosate. If you substitute aspartate, it's similar because it's bulkier, it's got a negative charge. It's a model for glyphosate. So I find proteins that are destroyed if that glycine becomes aspartate by the code change, in a genetic mutation. And it's interesting because I keep discovering new ones. And one that I only discovered recently, within the last few months, is a dehydrogenase. It's a dehydrogenase that works on fatty acids. And it's actually essential for fatty acid oxidation in the mitochondria. And if that enzyme is broken, then the body can't use fats. It disrupts the body's ability to use fats as a source of energy, which could force you to have discomfort in eating fatty foods, and you would want to eat a non-fat diet. It actually is. So when you have a genetic mutation in that dehydrogenase enzyme, there's a characteristic disease that's very severe. And these kids are born, they have failure to thrive. And they're very picky eaters. They have a lot of food issues, and they have cognitive dysfunction that looks a lot like autism. They have basically autistic features, and typically they don't make it to they die young. They die very young. These kids that have this genetic mutation. Now, so glyphosate doesn't kill every single version of that enzyme, only the ones that get infected with glyphosate. So it's a milder version of that same condition. But I think that one enzyme, that dehydrogenase, can explain a lot about autism, and autism has actually been associated with the production of metabolites of fatty acids that are toxic. Like, for example, people talk a lot about omega-6 fats, and Mercola is big on saying don't eat the seed oils. All this messaging about the seed oils. Well, the seed oils are going to be a problem if that enzyme's not working, because they go down a different pathway and they produce these toxic metabolites that then cause, for example, fatty liver disease. So this condition causes fatty liver disease. And in fact, when a mother is pregnant with a child that's defective with a gene defect in this particular gene, the dehydrogenase, the mother develops fatty liver disease during pregnancy. It's really interesting. And fatty liver disease is one of those conditions that's going up dramatically in step with glyphosate. And there have been studies, both in humans and in mice, that show that glyphosate causes fatty liver disease, even at very low doses. So it's sort of connecting dots. And I knew enough. By the time I discovered this particular enzyme, I'm like, oh my God, this is so perfect for explaining autism as a consequence of glyphosate, because of this defect in the ability to metabolize fats, which also impacts the mitochondria, because the mitochondria, normally fats are a terrific source of energy. They're better than sugars, for example, as a source of energy. But when you've got a broken version of that enzyme, you can't do it. You're going to get in trouble.
Would that make you crave sugar?
Probably. It would make you not like to eat fatty foods and to enjoy and to eat more sugar, because the sugar is going to substitute. Sugar can go through the mitochondria, no problem, but the fats can't. So fats are, they're a high energy food. You probably know that. They have a lot of calories for their size. So people tend to go on a low fat diet if they're trying to reduce their calorie load,
Wow. All right. So I'm wondering where to go from here, because this is so fascinating. I'm using all of my concentration just to understand it.
I know. Sorry. Of course, the microbes, are crucial. That was where I started. And the first paper I wrote about glyphosate was about the gut microbiome and its disruption by glyphosate. And that is very clear. I understand quite well now. The bacteria that are really essential in the infant gut are very sensitive to glyphosate. Lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, they're very sensitive. And then when they get killed off by glyphosate, then the pathogens start to overgrow. And that's how you get inflammatory gut, because you get the immune cells attacking the pathogens. The pathogens are producing metabolites that you can't deal with because you can't sulfate them. Also, the liver type enzymes, the cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver that are there to metabolize these toxic, to take care of them, to remove them. Those enzymes are also suppressed by glyphosate. So when the sulfation is suppressed, and when the fatty acid is suppressed, and when the glutathione is actually suppressed as well, glutathione is a really important antioxidant. That's why you get liver disease. So all these things, they all fit. It's a beautiful story, really. I love biology, and I feel like I've figured out a lot of it. I'm not done yet. I'm still working on it, but I think a lot of it makes good sense to me. And there are all these diseases. I think diabetes is another one. There's many papers that have come out in the last few years, just since 2017. I almost can't keep up with them anymore. Wow. That are showing glyphosate's true colors. And they're finding Alzheimer's, they're finding autism, papers about autism and glyphosate, papers about fatty liver disease, papers about transgenerational effects, where the great-grandmother gets exposed and it has effects on the great-grandchild. It's amazing. This was in mouse studies. So they're really starting to notice that this molecule is not innocent. And I think the researchers hopefully will finally get enough of these papers published that the lawyers will be able to make a case. And they're already working on the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma quite successfully. But I would love to see enough research on connecting glyphosate to autism to start to get lawsuits around that, because I think that would really take that take that molecule down. It would force the industry to stop producing this molecule, which is where we need to go. We need to get the industry so uncomfortable with producing this molecule that they won't sell it. Not because even the lawsuits could drive them out of business, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need government regulation.
Right. Yeah. So non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was linked to glyphosate. And then finally, the World Health Organization's IARC committee, and I think I forget what that stands for. It's the cancer committee. They finally said that was a probable carcinogen. But of course, I'm sure you know that the EPA had done that back in the 1980s. And then Monsanto came back and changed the EPA's mind with a lot of
exactly. They managed to get EPA to decide it's not a carcinogen.
Mm-hmm.
And the EPA is sticking to that message. And now other countries are using the EPA as an example to say they think glyphosate's fine too. So we're getting, I don't know if you know what's going on right now, but both Australia and individual states in this country are trying to pass laws that would basically make glyphosate like the vaccines. It is so essential. We can't live without it. And therefore, we can't allow these people who get non-Hodgkin's lymphoma to sue the industry.
Right.
That is so awful. I mean, that's the direction they're headed. And it just breaks my heart because I thought it looked pretty hopeless for them to me, but they always find a way,
Yeah, they're looking to the Farm Bill for this, and they've got their language in there, their preemption language that would lock the EPA into the decisions the EPA has already made because of Monsanto's bullying, because of Monsanto's fake science.
And then once it's EPA, it's even Australia, by example. They say, oh, well, the EPA thinks it's fine, so we do too, So EPA is a powerful influencer on the rest of the world to say, oh, yeah, this chemical is great. We don't need to worry about it. And meanwhile, people are getting so sick,
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of surprised that Europe didn't do something a whole lot different. It looked like
Europe
was going to. And I guess because Europe is centralized, it does make it a little bit easier for Monsanto to lobby now the European Union and the European Commission and their regulatory system at the Europe level.
That's exactly what they do. They disenfranchise the bottom and they control the top. That's the whole game. Even beyond the country level, right? These international agreements. So they've learned how to focus all the power and then give them so much money that they can't say no, right? It's basically, okay, your chemical's awesome, It really frustrates me. And of course, it's also because its method of toxicity is subtle and it takes time. It's a slow kill because it's just mucking up all of those proteins and just causing you to feel generally, unhealthy. But it doesn't just knock you out. It's not like a poison to the way a lot of other things it'd be more obvious that there was a problem.
Right.
It's subtle. And that's a huge problem because it's harder to prove.
Yeah. I mean, non-Hodgkin lymphoma takes 20 years sometimes to show up. So it's really amazing that with that lead or that lag time, that the science became so clear on that, which is kind of scary because then, it's like not everyone is Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Not everyone is digging into these things and seeing the breadth of the toxicity in the body. But thank goodness that you have, because your information at least can save individual lives. People who hear this, who understand the necessity of eating organic, especially for their children who have autism spectrum symptoms. You're saving lives, and you have been for a long time. I'm just so grateful to you for everything that you've done. You wrote Toxic Legacy. Do you have a plan for putting together? I know you're doing research every day.
I would love to. I would love to write a book on deuterium, and I'm hoping someday I'll have time to do that. And that's a topic for another day. But
okay,
glyphosate, that's a very exciting space for me right now. And I have done several podcast interviews and also presentations around deuterium. That's my main focus right now. It's so fascinating. It has to do with dehydrogenases as well. So we talked about that one dehydrogenase, but glyphosate suppresses multiple dehydrogenases. I think that may be its biggest problem. And dehydrogenases are essential for maintaining low deuterium in the mitochondria. So that's a whole story we could do in another podcast interview, but I'll just give you that.
Well, I guess I should because I'm not ready to ask you questions about that one yet. But you did have some interesting things to say at the CHD Food Summit. You gave an entire presentation on the environmental impact
of glyphosate.
And you talked about how the same protein production problem that glyphosate causes by inserting itself where a real protein or piece of protein needs to be. You said that that impacts a plant's ability to use carbon and
Yes,
nitrogen from the soil.
that's right.
That blew my
Yes,
mind. I was not expecting that one. Maybe you could
right.
say a few words about how that works.
Yeah, and of course, pulling carbon dioxide out of the air and turning it into organic matter, that is so important for climate change. We
Right.
have too much
Listen,
carbon dioxide,
yeah.
and we also have too much nitrous oxide. Both of those are consequence of the plants not being able to utilize the carbon dioxide and the nitrogen that's available to them from the air, and so that's messing up the air in a big way that's causing the climate change. I think glyphosate is a much bigger player in climate change than we realize. And papers have shown there's a protein called rubisco, which has what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif. And my book explains what that is. It has to do with the glycine. And that rubisco is the most common protein on the planet. And it's only found in plants. And plants use it as a critical enzyme for photosynthesis. So and it was like 25-fold, reduced by 25-fold in an experiment where they exposed GMO soybeans to glyphosate, and it caused a tremendous reduction in rubisco, which is really disturbing because that means that the plants can't grab the carbon dioxide out of the air as efficiently as they should, and which of course means more carbon dioxide is going to stay in the air. And the nitrous oxide is actually 100 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, maybe 300 times worse. And so, and nitrous oxide is produced when they can't take up the nitrogen, and the bacteria that support nitrogen uptake are getting damaged by glyphosate, and it's disrupting the ability to take up the nitrate. It's a particular enzyme that turns the nitrogen into ammonia so the plants can grab it. That enzyme is also suppressed by glyphosate. So it's really scary to think about these major enzymes in the plants that are going to be disturbed. And there's another one in the shallow seas. And this was all part of that talk. And I only discovered this one recently too. And it's really fascinating because it makes a molecule called dimethyl sulfide. And dimethyl sulfide, these organisms, archaea in the, I think I'm not sure if they're archaea, but they're microbes in the shallow seas that make dimethyl sulfide. And dimethyl sulfide is actually something that seeds clouds. And so those guys the dimethyl sulfide making guys get hurt by glyphosate. So it reduces their numbers in the shallow sea. So when you've got all the glyphosate coming out of the Mississippi River and going into the Caribbean, and then those microbes are getting killed off, and now they don't make as much dimethyl sulfide, you don't get as much cloud seeding, you get a lot more sunny weather, you get heating up of the oceans, and now you destroy the coral. So I think that's all connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's got to be. Yeah, that's so disturbing. But it's such an insidiously criminal, evil business model because, Monsanto said, oh, we're going to genetically modify the crops so they don't need as many pesticides. And of course, with that, they were talking about the crops that produce their own insecticides.
Right.
So we can eat the insecticides. The bees can eat the insecticides. Everybody can eat the insecticides growing in the plants. But they didn't mention that, of course, their business model for the GMO herbicide tolerant crops was going to be to sell a lot more herbicide. But it never occurred to me that this would also mean that farmers need more fertilizer, that they would just keep using more fertilizer as all of the nitrates run into the water.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a mess.
Thank you so much. Anything else that you want to say before?
Well, I have hope for not the government, but the individual in the bottom up grassroots. People need to go organic. They need to tell their friends, their family, their neighbors, go organic. Don't use glyphosate on your yard. Spread the word mouth to mouth. I think if we can get the population educated on the importance of getting rid of this chemical, then I think we can really make a difference. We don't need the government. I mean, the government, it doesn't look like it's going to come through. So forget them, do it on our own, and we can do that. And if we refuse to buy the food, they won't make it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the way you've dug into this creates so many interesting stories to share with friends and family. You don't have to just be a nag and say it's bad for you. You can share all of this fascinating science. So you seem to have fun learning all these.
Oh, I do. I love my job. I pinch myself. I can't believe I'm so lucky. I get paid to just spend all my time studying glyphosate. It's great. Yeah. I appreciate my sponsor.
Well, thank you so much for everything.
Thank you. All right.